It is indeed a proud privilege to introduce Probal Dasgupta, an accomplished author, a historian, a strategic thinker whose recent work has added a significant chapter to India's defense literature. Probal is an alumnus of Indian Military Academy. He is a veteran who has served in Gorkha Rifle Regiment for about 9 years, before his second innings as a Brown Myers Fellow, a Tata Scholar at Columbia University in USA. Probal, in the acknowledgement section of your book, you have highlighted that it takes an entire village to complete a book. So my question to you is, what prompted you to write this particular book? Why did you choose General Sundarji as the main character, and why the name General Brass Tacks?
Thank you very much for having me over here. General Zaki, officers and ladies here, thank you for having me here, and it's such a pleasure and privilege to be back here again. You know, we talk about the nuclear doctrine. The nuclear doctrine was born here, a few hundred meters. And that happened in 1980-81, when the seminars were introduced by General Sundarji here in Mhow. So history begins from places around us. And many a times we go looking for history elsewhere. It starts from where we are. So one of the things I thought of was why General Sundarji? Because I would rather write about a story that had not been written about. So my theme, since you were kind enough to talk about the previous books, has been to foreground narratives that had not been brought to the surface earlier. And here was one, and I was breaking away from the genre of writing a narrative to a biography. So when I started with the village that we spoke about, the village became a city and then a country, because there's so many people along the journey, along the course of the writing of this book that came along. There are sources that you go looking for, that you plan. Why Sundarji? Because when you look at him, and when we look at many of us who grew up in the 1980s, have our public memory in the recesses of our minds from then, which still sit there. So when we look at 1980s, it was an entire decade of turbulence, a stormy decade, tempestuous, full of events. We had assassinations of 4 premiers and 1 army chief. We had an arms deal. We had several governments. We had the Indian Army operating in the deserts of Rajasthan, in the plains of Punjab, fighting in the heights of Siachen, in the mountains of Arunachal, in the swamps of Northeast, in the jungles of Jaffna, and at the end, in the island of Maldives. And all of this bore the signature, imprint, and legacy of this gentleman.
Brass tacks was something which was General Sundarji's legacy. He was known to be very famous for it. But apart from that, General Sundarji was also known to be a general who would question the status quo. And in fact, in your book, you highlighted that General Sundarji used to create an environment wherein the officers would be able to think freely, think innovatively, and question the assumptions. Now, today, Probal, we're sitting amongst audience who are going to soon take over command of their regiments, maybe in the next 3 to 6 months. How do we, as the next generation of commanding officers, sow the seed of constructive dissent in our regiments?
I think when we talk about dissent, it can be calibrated as encouraging dissent and differences of opinion pertaining to your area of influence and your area of interest. So you can encourage dissent in your area of influence so that you can actually make the changes, right? Now, speaking from the events and incidents in the book, and just to also answer your question, it's a culture that you form, and that culture will come to how General Sundarji wrote a letter where he talks about all of these things. And he talks about the fact that it is a culture that has to be brought about right from an early stage. It's an ongoing process. You cannot expect dissent suddenly happening, people expressing opinions, if you haven't fostered a culture of that nature right from the start. Also, it's important to understand what are the red lines of dissent, so that it's not an anarchist dissent, but it is also, I've called him an anti-status quoist, the most anti-status quoist of chiefs. But it does not mean that he was anti-organization. It was about improving the state of the organization. A young officer, he dissented. It was Major Shamsher Mehta. And he said, this is all wrong. What you have said, this doesn't work. So General Sundarji said, young man, we are sitting here in the sand model exercise. What works or doesn't work will only be decided when we go on ground. And Major Shamsher Mehta had come had the reputation of his experience in 1971, his exploits. So he had his point. But officers there then told Major Shamsher Mehta that your career is over. You're gone because you have dissented in public with the great General Sundarji. 2 weeks later, Major Shamsher Mehta receives a call to join General Sundarji's staff. The rest is history because he goes on to become his principal staff officer for years, and he went on to retire as an illustrious army commander, Lieutenant General Shamsher Mehta, we all know.
I'm sure, Prabal, this would encourage most of us, also sitting across, and us also, to encourage professional dissent in times to come, and encourage officers to take more initiatives in life. Coming on to the exercise Brass Tack, which was one of the largest exercises of its time, and few termed it as an exercise led by an American trained general, combining the British doctrine with Soviet equipment. Because of the scale of the exercise led both India and Pakistan on the brink of war. Now, may I request your opinion and insights about the maneuver warfare in its present capacity, and does it hold good in the similar context, or maneuver by effect in the integrated multi-domain operations take preeminence? I would also request you about your insights on Operation Rajiv and supposedly Operation Trident being planned in a similar time frame. Thank you.
General Sundarji had studied 1971 and 1965 very carefully. So Brass Tacks happened in 1986. It was 4 times bigger than any NATO exercise. There was Archer, which had happened in 1981, 82 or 83, which was a NATO exercise which had 100,000 troops. Brass Tacks had over 400,000 troops involved. It was the largest exercise since Second World War. So when the thought was to move through the deserts of Rajasthan into Pakistan, and there is the opinion that gets divided. The opinion was whether it was to take out the Kahuta nuclear facility that was fledgling and that was just coming into shape. So the opinions were divided in terms of whether that was going to happen or it was just an exercise. Whatever that may be, we can talk about it, and I have my opinion on what was possibly the case. But Pakistan was building its nuclear facility, and Pakistan was rattled. Because he was rattled that something might happen and forces might go in through the deserts of Rajasthan and go 500 miles inside Pakistan. India had the capability. General Sundarji was somebody who had combined firepower with mobility, maneuver. He had understood that from his time in Fort Leavenworth and thereafter as well, like I said. So Zia did not sort of find comfort. So he came here, he proposed peace, and India and Pakistan started to initiate dialogues at the secretary level for demilitarization, for the LOC, etc., LC, and talks started in Geneva, Oman. 9 months later, Zia-ul Haq was assassinated. Few years later, 1994, Ambassador John Gunther Dean, who was the US ambassador in 1988, had long retired, and so had General Sundarji. John Gunther Dean was in Paris, and he had invited General and Mrs. Sundarji over for dinner. John Gunther Dean asks General Sundarji, simple question, but a hard one. He says, who killed Zia? Who do you think? General Sundarji had a simple answer. Don't you know? It was you guys. And what he did, he brought in mobility, maneuver warfare, which is relevant, which is important today as well. And he brought it then. He brought it into our being. The tanks moved at a much slower pace in 1981. He made them move 6 or 7 times faster. And that, when you bring in change, like I said earlier, he was anti-status quo. This is what it is. So you move the dial forward, which he did, which ruffled a lot of feathers. But the result was 1986-87 Brass Tacks. You spoke about Op Trident. Well, again, the idea, and this is again a theory, that Brass Tacks was a smoke screen to actually initiate Op Trident. We don't know yet. We would perhaps not know. Or, that was one of the plans that was certainly there. What was the plan? The plan was to paradrop inside Pakistan, beyond the lines, and the objective was to win back to territories, to areas in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is Gilgit and Skardu. But that was the closest that one had come. And I would stick my neck out and say that it was General Sundarji, perhaps the only chief who would have dared to do that then. And imagine the extent, just imagine the grand extent of having Rajasthan, Punjab, and you also have Op Trident. I do not think that had ever come about before or after that.
Prabal, you did mention that in 1987, Pakistan was worried that India would exercise the nuclear option. The similar question was raised even last year during Operation Sindoor. I would like to just take the audience back to 50s and 60s when India did not have the nuclear capabilities. The Indian policy makers were looking at two superpowers in a Cold War. We all have read about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The policy makers of India started viewing the security dynamics through the prism of nuclear capabilities. And that prompted General Sundarji also to think about the nuclear asymmetry. Like you mentioned in your earlier answers, he was posted here in the College of Combat Warfare. And I believe he was tasked to work on the nuclear doctrine. And one of the points that he stressed upon was the no first use policy. Prabal, I would like to ask you, what were the dynamics like when India was going through this nuclear journey? And what was General Sundarji's role in it?
So, just to take a step back and to explain that, India's nuclear journey actually started in 1964. General Somnath, after the 1962 war, he had drawn up an entire cost structure that would be involved in creating a nuclear weapon. But after 1962, after 1964, when he did this, the Indian political dispensation was not really favored towards developing a nuclear weapon. 1965, Lal Bahadur Shastri was the Prime Minister, was not really in favor of it. Subsequently, the nuclear program went into the back burner. It was in 1981 here where he started the seminars on nuclear thinking. The early thoughts of military as a carrier of nuclear weapons, as a part of the entire nuclear doctrine, was born here. And there are papers here which you must read. There are, the originals from then, which you have here, and I think that is a must read for everybody. Because that tells you how we started this entire process. 1983, the trigger was that, and after 1971, Pakistan realized that the only way they could face India was to become a nuclear power. It was the first time after independence that the three chiefs wrote to the Prime Minister saying that, well, we need to be a nuclear power. Up until then, the nuclear theory had involved the scientists, the theorists, the politicians, the political scientists, but there was no sign of military thinking or thought leaders. It was then that in 1985 that a committee was formed. But military thinking towards this was still very conservative. General Vaidya was not very convinced at that time. So there's an anecdote I mentioned in the book that the committee was being formed and General Vaidya was on leave. And Admiral Telyani says that, we'll form the committee and quickly get General Sundarji in before General Vaidya is back, because we wanted to move forward quickly. So that's how General Sundarji was brought in. It was General Sundarji and K. Subramaniam who wrote the nuclear doctrine together.
So, no, that's a very interesting perspective, sir. And for a moment now, let's try and shift our focus from the Western borders. And as you spoke about China, my favorite chapter in your book is a chapter which you very wittingly, you've titled it as Chinese Checkers. And in that chapter, you brought about how the Indian Army was able to repel the Chinese aggression in 1967. And General Sundarji took very bold, initiative-driven decisions. And the actions that he did at that time is something that we have now formalized in our tactics, and we are calling it race to the passes. But what I want to know is that in today's day and environment where we are living in a multi-domain operational world, all of us in uniform, irrespective of our ranks, are all strategic corporals. Small little tactical action that we take may have very major strategic or political ramifications, like we saw during the Galwan crisis. Is there still space available for us to actually emulate this bold, initiative-driven decision-making characteristic trait of General Sundarji today? Could it be done? What are your views on that, sir?
Yeah. Again, something that has cut through the spectrum of time and retained its relevance, I would say. It is more relevant today than ever. Especially, I see technology as a force multiplier in this respect. That technology enables us to be ready and live, and also at the same time allows, I would look at it, sometimes the questions asked that, well, does technology debar the strategic corporal phenomena? I don't think so. It should be seen as a force multiplier. It can be either, but it should ideally be seen as a force multiplier. Again, I'll give you an example from the earlier book. And when I was writing, one of the reasons when you write a book, you write it for two things. One is a narrative that you write. Okay, that's a narrative. This happened, that happened. But the other part is the interpretation, the message. What is the big picture that comes out? One of the big pictures that came out when I looked at this book and when I was doing writing Watershed 1967 was the connect on China. You mentioned China. And there we go to General Sagat. And I'm not even talking about 1967. I'm talking about 1965 now, which is rather underplayed. The story of this concept of taking a tactical decision that had its strategic ramifications starts in 1965, because that was the time the Chinese, everything has a context. So when I talk about 1965 and China, and that time, when the Chinese pressurized India to move back from two forward posts, Natula and Jelepla, two different actions were undertaken with two different outcomes and ramifications on the geopolitics of the day and that of history that was to follow. And then, when, again, we go back to that pot of dissent as well here, a bit. Because when the pressure was applied for the Chinese side to pull back, for India to pull back from Natula and Jelepla, there was the question of whether you go by protocol or you take your operational call at the local level with dissenting from the higher directive, right? So General Sagat then had faced a lot of pressure to pull back from Natula. From Jelepla, the Indian army pulled back. The Chinese came and sat there. And they're there even today. At Natula, General Sagat decided not to pull back. He faced a lot of pressure, and I write about it in Watershed 1967 as to how the calls kept coming. We talk about technology. Technology was also there then, but he had his own reasons. He stood by that. He stood by his call. So if I were to talk about it conceptually, I call it leadership. It's a leadership dilemma. It's called the decision dilemma, the tragedy of choices, where you have a choice to follow a directive or a choice to take your call. I'm not saying that one is better than the other or higher than the other. It is the judgment that you have that defines the great from the good.
Now I'll shift the focus to other chapter of a book named Pavan Putra. Now moving to Sri Lanka in 1987, where the Indian forces were initially deployed for peacekeeping operations, but involved into conflicts. Now their deployment had led to many questions about the preparation, inter-agency synergy, and also the civil-military coordination. May I have your insights about what lessons should we draw from the Operation Pavan, and how should we provide military advice to our superiors to avoid such incidents in the future?
Operation Pavan is again set in the context of that decade in terms of time. And it came on the back of what we just discussed, Sondarumchu. It came on the back of brass tacks. So General Sundarji was riding high on confidence, and you can call it hubris, confidence, overconfidence, but that was there. So the decisions taken were not aligned, the military objectives in Sri Lanka were not aligned to the political aims. So when he asked me about what are the lessons, the lesson is that, whenever we look at a campaign or a decision like that, the idea is to have a whole of nation approach. The next day when Prabhakaran has to go back, he goes back with Major Madan Gopal Iyengar, who I mentioned, he called me up later when I was writing book. So he goes to leave Prabhakaran, and he's a Tamil. So he speaks to Prabhakaran and the others who were on the flight. Then he comes back to debrief in Delhi. The three chiefs are sitting there. Major Madan Gopal Iyengar was asked, what do you think by General Sundarji? So he says, sir, I don't think they are ready for peace. They're all 16-year-olds carrying cyanide capsules who are traveling. I spoke with them. They are readying themselves for a long game, for a long war. General Sundarji dismisses him because he had already made up his mind. He did not take the opinion of Major Madan Gopal Iyengar. That's another kind of example. And when you're writing, the idea is also to have a critique about leadership here. So my point here was the military objectives was not aligned with the political objectives, and I think that is the thing that we need to be cognizant of even today.
Thank you, Prabal. Away from all the operations, I would like to take you to the minds of the senior leaders when they're thinking. The senior leaders have a way of conveying their thoughts to the junior leaders through demi-official letters. In the book, you have mentioned the letter that General Sundarji wrote to the officers of Indian Army. Now, this particular letter became a benchmark for the entire Indian Army. However, he felt that there were certain qualities that were missing, according to him at that point of time. Now, I as a would-be commanding officer, what should I be looking at to address those gaps in the junior leaders? Can you just throw some light on that?
This is a document that every young officer must read. He speaks about values. Like, we talk about modernization, we talk about leadership in terms of current geopolitical changes, technology. All of these will change, but the basic human values, conduct will never change. And it is and that's the bedrock. That's the bedrock of whatever you do. And he talks about tehzeeb, he talks about conduct, he talks about all of that. Those values, the way you conduct yourself, the integrity of your intellect must not be compromised. Right? Talk about integrity of intellect is the ability to speak up, to talk about what you feel is right. The letter is not, it is not a critique about the organization. It is about the values that we must keep, we must guard, and we must guard very ferociously. I mean, we must stay and abide by them. So he talks about all of that. He talks about what do they mean, how do they stand up to your, to your everyday decision making in life. And these are things that it's something that's a Bible that should be read, that should continue to be a part of our cultural orientation, our cultural DNA. This is the cultural DNA. This doesn't change. Everything else might, but this doesn't change.
Probably today we are living in the decade of transformation. Our vision for 2047 has already been spelled out in black and white. Add to that every day we are getting new structures which is empowering us, like the Bhairav battalions, the Yashni platoons, Shaurya squadrons. In addition to that, the Agnipath scheme, the Agniveer that are coming in with a very higher threshold of technology. So, how do you compare these two visions? The Vision 2020 that General Sundarji professed and Vision 2047 that we have displayed in front of us. Is Vision 2047 an extension of his Vision 2020, or are they both mutually exclusive? What is your take on that?
Imagine he was writing and thinking about this 25 years ago. So, in the context of that, is 2020, you said is 2020 relevant for 2047? Yes, so if you look at it in the 1980s and 90s, he was looking at 2020. So here today, when we talk about 2020, we must look at what we need to do to get to 2047. And all of this, you spoke about the various aspects, add to that Agni Varsha, several of these things that are happening. Again, the idea is to have a future mindset. And the idea is to as a military leader, to position oneself as the future mindset in the context of the global changes and the continuum. And yes, as far as technology is concerned, I always say that, there are two wars going on, and we have forgotten about the second war, the Russia-Ukraine war, such is the world that we live in. But the fact is, what he would have done today, just to add to this, he would have brought in the changes right at the start of the Ukraine war itself, and quick thinking, risk-taking. But that is what is adapted to the, if I were to take an analogy of the T20 mindset, he had it years ago.
General Sundarji's story is one that is set alongside the trajectory, the arc of India's post-independence history starting from 1947 onwards. He was perhaps one of the rare Indian Army officers who raised the tricolour inside Pakistan on the 15th of August 1947. And what happened later? He was part of the partition refugee evacuation. He found himself to be a part of Gandhi's school. He was playing basketball in Delhi when he was called to the Birla House, to that Mahatma Gandhi had just been assassinated. He led Gandhi's school, and from then on to most events in India's post-independence history, he found himself on the sidelines of events, and he drew from them and had huge influence on the events, particularly in the 1980s when he was first the Western Army commander and then the military chief. When a whole lot of events happened in that tumultuous and rather stormy decade, and the center of it all was General Sundarji, who also thereafter put India's nuclear doctrine and was a transformative face of India's military and strategic thinking. Perhaps the one big message, the one big part that he played was to influence political thinking of that time. And in that, he perhaps rather stick my neck out and say that he is the only Indian military leader who has had an influence on political thinking, on the nation's thinking in a democracy. And that is rare. A military leader having a role to play in political decision making of his age, of that age, in a regular democracy is very, very rare. He also saw the future, saw India as part of the own future. General Sundarji remains, for that reason and for many other reasons, the most important military leader that India has had.